In 1538, the horse was reintroduced into North America by European explorers and into Florida. In 1538, the horses are going to become lost or stolen. They became feral. The natives had hunted the horses to extinction 10,000 years ago. There used to be horses in North America, and there was Native Americans, and the natives killed all the horses? How in the hell? 1538 is when you're going to start seeing a bunch of wild horses running around all over the place, since they were either lost or stolen. So 1538, Florida, that's important. Now that you got De Sanctimonious down there saying that you're not allowed to read any history, you're not allowed to read anymore. Apparently in Florida, they're taking all the books out of the damn schools, taking all the books out of the bookshelves. They're just going to pile all the books into a big old pile and set them on fire. So the poor Floridians are not going to know who they are. Florida was the third state to secede from America. Well, that's why he doesn't want the 1619 project. Florida was the third state to secede from America. You had first South Carolina said adios, and Mississippi said adios. And then Florida, just like a Johnny come lately, just like a goddamn Johnny copycat. Mississippi says they're free. South Carolina said that they're free on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi said January 9th, 1861. Florida, they quit America January 10th, 1861. Big shocker that Florida quit America. They're the third state to quit America. A bunch of quitting sons of bitches. They're such big-ass racist sons of bitches. They were the third state to quit America. And Florida were a bunch of anti-American revolutionary motherfuckers. There were a bunch of loyalists down there, and they were, Spanish forever. Back in 2000 BC, people were making fired pottery in Florida. In 2000 BC, so that's 4,000 years ago. In 1450 BC, Florida has the oldest burial mound in the East, dating to 1450 BC. They're not going to know about any of this. Florida's colonized by Spanish at first, and then the Spanish kept Florida for as long as possible. I remember when I was in third grade in Florida, they taught me about Ponce de Leon. And I like that name. Don't that name just sound great? Ponce de Leon. Didn't Ponce de Leon, didn't he bring a black man or something? I'm pretty sure Ponce de Leon, there's been black people in the beginning of American history. Florida's motto, the motto of Florida is white trash be white trashing. White trash going to white trash. What you going to do? What you going to do? Florida is the second home for the meth-addled trailer park rats of Kansas. For those white trash from Kansas, when they're like, you know what, we're sick of this, they go to Florida. The actual motto of Florida is "In God We Trust." So there's a goddamn problem right there, right? In God you trust, huh? Why'd you let those horses just run around all feral and shit? 1776 Floridians are a bunch of anti-American revolutionary motherfuckers. A majority of Florida residents were loyalist, both the East and the West Coast Florida. They declined to send representatives to any of the sessions of the Continental Congress. So while the American Revolution was going on, Florida was like, we're going to sit this one out. But then when the Confederacy began, Florida's like, we're gonna step this one in. This is a fight that we are going. They didn't care about the revolution. They didn't care about freedom. They didn't care about the Bill of Rights. They didn't care about the Constitution. Didn't care about a democratic constitutional republic. Didn't give a shit about the rule of law. Didn't give a shit about the three branches of government. Florida did not give a flying fluck. They didn't give a flying fluck at all. Them motherfuckers. And then the Confederates, they're going to be the third one to fight that fucking war. That's a war they want. That's a war they don't want to fight against the king, King George. Never! I don't know, Florida. You kind of keep on getting it wrong. There's like, should we do the American Revolution? Nah. What about the Confederacy? Yes. World War II? Let's be on the side of, no, let's not. You have bad instincts, Florida. Florida, you have terrible instincts. During the American Revolution, Florida loyalists fought for the English crown, for the throne. They fought against American patriots in South Carolina and Georgia. You had Continental forces that attempted to invade East Florida early in the conflict. But Americans got defeated May 17th, 1777 at the Battle of Thomas Creek in today's Nassau County when American Colonel John Baker surrendered to the British. Another American incursion into the same area was repelled at the Battle of Alligator Bridge on June 30th, 1778. The two Floridas, East and West Florida, remained loyal to Great Britain throughout the war, but Britain is going to lose. And so the Treaty of Paris is they're going to, leave, but they're going to give Florida to the Spaniards. So Alligator Bridge, you have a bunch of British loyalists. Spain, participating indirectly in the war as an ally of France, captured Pensacola from the British 1781. So that means you had the British that was in Spanish Florida looking over their shoulder for the Americans and Spanish Florida. What a bunch of dumb fucking goddamn loyalists fucking... They love their kings, don't they? Oh, King George III will never disobey you, King George III. So the Peace of Paris, 1783, is going to end the Revolutionary War, and all of Florida is going to be given to Spain, to the Spanish, to get the Spanish control. So Spain and Britain were allies, right? So they get to keep Florida. But the boundaries wasn't specified. Dun, dun, dun. It's the 31st parallel north. Eventually, we'll figure it out at the Treaty of San Lorenzo. In 1795. So Florida's not going to know who the hell they are. They're not going to know what the hell happened with their nation states. They're not going to know that, before the English, there was Spanish. They're not going to know any of this stuff. They're just going to be blind. They're just going to be whatever Don Sanctimonious says, whatever Mr. Goddamn the Spanish wanted to. So 100 original tribes in Florida. How many Native Americans were there in Florida? Don't ask anybody that graduated from a Florida school. Don't ask anybody that graduated from a Florida school, the original Native Americans in Florida. They won't know jack shit about that. Other tribes in Florida at the time of first contact include the AIS and the Calusa. The Calusa and the Jaga and the Miami, the Tequesta, the Tocobaga, the Timucua, the Appalachee. You think the Appalachian Mountains are named from the Appalachian Native Americans? At the time of the first European contact in the 1500s, Florida was inhabited by 350,000 people. 350,000 people, but anthropologist Henry F. Dubins, he says there was actually twice as many, 700,000 in 1492. The Spanish Empire sent Spanish explorers recording nearly 100 tribes in Florida, 100 names of groups they had encountered ranging from organized political entities such as the Appalachee. The Appalachee had a population of 50,000. 50,000. Pueblo has a population of 100,000. So the Appalachee were half the size of Pueblo, Colorado. To villages with no known political affiliation, there were an estimated 150,000 speakers of the dialects of the Timucua language, but the Timucua were organized as groups of villages and did not share a common culture. Wow. So everybody was speaking this Timucua. Were the Appalachians speaking that Timucua? So you had Native Americans all over the place, right? About 1 million, right? Between 300,000, 700,000, so between 500,000 to more. You had the Timucua, Appalachee, Tocobaga, Tequesta, Miami, Jaga, Calusa, the Ace, AIS, the Ace. So Floridians are a bunch of Confederate pieces of shit who hates America, hates the Constitution, hates the Bill of Rights, hates the three branches of government. They can't stand federalism. They cannot stand that they were a part of the United States of America. They want to be a bunch of slaving pieces of shit. 100. Now, you have the 1619 Project. I like the 1619 Project. A lot. A lot. You have about 20 black folks that we find in Jamestown. So that's exciting. So you have, the founding of America was Jamestown, and these Europeans tried to establish a colony, and it was so tough. But they also imported black folks, treated black folks like they weren't people. There was actually a contract between the damn Queen Anne. Queen Anne, she had like 23% stock in the contract, and Queen Anne was going to supply like 4,000 slaves. The British were going to be the ones in charge of the transatlantic slave trade. They signed a contract. So, just step down, Spain and France. The British are going to take care of it, but they'll go ahead and provide. So they try to monopolize it through a contract. The problem with the 1619 Project was that they don't actually point out the first time that black folks, or even black folks as slaves, came to America. Before 1619, before Jamestown, we had the 1586 Project, the 1528 Project, the 1580, 1513 to 1526 Project. That's the biggest one that I really want to expand, is the 1526 Project. Before the European conquest of Florida, there was no black slaves. There was no black slaves before the European conquest. So the first slaves in America were actually in Florida. Big shocker, right? Imported by the Spanish and the English. But the Confederate fucking state, that's where the slavery first began, in Florida. Under the Spanish, carried on by the English. So the 1580 Project, you had St. Augustine. This is a Florida colony, a Spanish Florida colony at St. Augustine. In 1580, the officials asked for permission to import slaves to bolster the workforce, and they got it. St. Augustine was like the most important settlement in Florida. It was bigger than a fort, a little bit more than a fort. It was frequently attacked and burned, with most residents killed or fled. Catholic missionaries used St. Augustine as a base of operations to establish over 100 far-flung missions throughout Florida. They converted 26,000 natives by 1655, but a revolt in 1656 and an epidemic in 1659 proved devastating. Pirate attacks and British raids were unrelenting, and the town was burned to the ground several times until Spain fortified St. Augustine with the Castillo de San Marcos and Fort Matazanas. So that doesn't tell you much about the black folks, but there were slaves. There were slaves in and around St. Augustine as early as 1580, which is, so many years, about 40 years prior to 1619. Now, Juan Garrido, this means handsome John. In Spanish, handsome John, Juan Garrido. This is the 1513 Project. Why? Because he was with Ponce de Leon. Juan Ponce de Leon. We don't need another Juan there, just Ponce de Leon. Ponce de Leon was one of the first major expedition into Florida. He was looking for the Fountain of Youth in 1513, Ponce de Leon. And he's going to die. He's going to die pretty quickly. But he brought Juan Garrido with him. So Juan Garrido and Esteban, between Juan Garrido and Esteban, these are the first great black Americans. Now, the 1526 Project is when you're going to see 100 black folks, and they're brought in as slaves. 1526. And what's kind of crazy is you have the mutineers who's mutiny against the government, but the slaves actually fight against the mutineers. And they call that a slave uprising, which it's not exactly now, is it? But 100 slaves, 100 enslaved African, probably mostly men, maybe some women. They went to South Carolina. They went to South Carolina with this fucking guy, Lucas Vasquez de Ayalon. Lucas Vasquez. So Lucas Vasquez goes to South Carolina to establish a colony, San Miguel de Guadalupe. So he establishes this Guadalupe colony, San Miguel de Guadalupe. It's a former Spanish colony in present-day Georgetown County, South Carolina. So Lucas Vasquez de, Alalon or something, 1526 is when he's going to establish this. That's the first European settlement in what becomes the continental U.S. The first European settlement is the San Miguel de Guadalupe, and the third European settlement in North America, north of Mexico. So that's huge. San Miguel de Guadalupe. You also had some black folks. Didn't you have some black folks? No. La Navidad. So you had 600 people that's going to go to establish this Guadalupe, San Miguel de Guadalupe. You had 600 Spanish conquistadors coming from Santo Domingo. 600 settlers, and you had a whole bunch of pigs and cows and shit. Sailors, some women and children and priests. Some say there's an unknown number of African slaves, but out of the 600 of the Spanish, 150 of them are going to live to tell about what had happened at the San Miguel de Guadalupe settlement of South Carolina in 1526. And the poor Floridian, a graduate from Florida, is not going to know about any of this. And this is actually fascinating stuff, okay? So you could the English could try to put it on the Spanish, but you're going to find out later, since Florida was Spanish Florida, a lot of the slaves would run to Florida, either to the Native American tribes or to the Spanish missionaries, and they would take them in, especially when they were at war. What's awesome about the black folks who ran to Florida and then went to the Native Americans, they were being accused of sheltering, black folks. But the Native American says, all we did was give some hungry people some food. And if you insist that that person is your property, then why don't you get it yourself? They want the Native Americans to deliver the black folks up to them. But it's like there was hungry people. We gave them food. You're acting like we're responsible for them. We just gave them some food. If you really want to capture them, go catch them yourself. And they didn't do that. So the black man was able to find freedom in Spanish Florida as well. So even though Spanish Florida established or started a lot of black slavery, and there is not a single European nation. You had the Swedish, and the Dutch and the Portuguese. I mean, they're all just as probably equally fucking brutal and terrible as the other ones. And in a way, thank goodness that the English were the most brutal, so that way, we could be here. They had 6 ships, 600 people, Jesuit missionaries, 100 black slaves, food and water, cattle and tools. When they reached North Carolina, or Georgia, as soon as they got to the mainland, their lead ship, the Capitana, struck a sandbar and sunk. So most of their supplies went to a watery grave. That's a bad omen. But they kept on going. They said, let's persist anyways. They had 6 ships, right? So they lost the first one, but there's still 5 other ships. And there's probably 700 people, right? Including the 100 slaves, pigs, cows, sheep, horses. They brought some horses too. So there's the first 100 black people in America, in South Carolina, when the Spanish tried to, and like I said, there was a mutiny, and then they overthrew the mutineers. It gets kind of dicey. Gets a little dicey. But we should have a 1526 project. In Jamestown, they said about 20 or so African slaves are going to go to Jamestown in 1619, but in 1526, there's 100 black men that's being used as slaves in this. And then the colony is going to go down, so who knows what the Native Americans and the black slaves, maybe it was doomed to begin with, but I wonder what resistance they added to. You also got a 1586 project. A 1586 project, Roanoke and Francis Drake. So you had, the lost island of Roanoke, the lost settlement of Roanoke. They tried to establish the first permanent English settlement. You had John Hawkins. John Hawkins and Francis Drake. They made 3 voyages to Guinea and Sierra Leone, and they enslaved between 1,200 to 1,400 Africans. So why do we say Sir Francis Drake? He's a fucking slave trading piece of shit. It was notably devastated in 1586 when English sea captain, sometimes pirate, Francis Drake, he plundered and burned the city of St. Augustine. So there is black folks in St. Augustine around 1580. 6 years later, he's going to burn St. Augustine, but not because they had slavery. He's the one bringing fucking slaves. So 1586, he stops by Roanoke Island with his slave ship. So we have a lot of, projects before 1619. And I like the earlier that we could think about, these dates. I like history, and it sucks that the written record only goes back, 400 years or so. So we got a 1586, 1528, 1580, 1513, and 1526 project that none of the Floridians are ever going to know about. Florida is actually a Spanish word. The name Florida is a Spanish word. And Florida means white trash. It actually means flowers. It was Ponce de Leon's 1513 expedition to Florida. That's the first official one. 1513. When was Florida discovered? 1513. He gave Florida its name, which means full of flowers. It's often stated he sighted the peninsula for the first time March 27, 1513. 1513, he thought it was an island. He probably saw one of the Bahamas at the time. He went ashore on Florida's east coast during the Spanish Easter feast. Pascua, Florida, April 7th, named the land La Pascua de la Florida. After briefly exploring the land south of present-day St. Augustine, the expedition sailed south to the bottom of the Florida Peninsula through the Florida Keys and up the west coast as far north as Charlotte Harbor, where they briefly skirmished with the Calusa before heading back to Puerto Rico. The fucking Calusa are goddamn badasses. And the Calusa said, "Get the hell out of here, Ponce de Leon." They kicked Ponce de Leon's ass in 1513, and in 1521 he's going to go back. He attempts to colonize Florida again, and the Calusa once again drive him off once again. That's incredible that the Calusa Native Americans were stronger than the Spanish conquistadors. It reminds me of the Taos Revolt. The Taos Rebellion, the Taos Revolution. For about 20 years, they, kicked the Spanish ass and didn't. Old Pope kicked the Spanish in the Tiwa and the Towa and the Tawe. Spanish attempts to explore and colonize Florida were disastrous. Ponce de Leon returned to the Charlotte Harbor area 1521 with equipment and settlers to start a colony and was soon driven off by hostile Calusa. So you have this man named Esteban, right? So we already talked about Juan Garrido. Juan Garrido was with Ponce de Leon. But this Esteban, a black slave from Morocco, he was in the Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition. They explored Florida's west coast in 1528. Panfilo had violent demands for gold and food, hostile relations with the Tocobaga, Native Americans. He's going to get whipped by the Native Americans too. The Tocobaga are going to kick Panfilo's ass. Facing starvation, unable to find his support ships, Panfilo attempted return to Mexico via rafts, but they're all lost at sea. He tries to build these rafts, and then there's a big storm, and everybody dies except for 4 people of the expedition, including Esteban, a black slave, and his master. So only the guy who owns Esteban and Esteban himself. Esteban is going to go on to do some great things. But Juan Garrido, Esteban, the whole point of the 1619 project is to know about the Estebans and the Juan Garridos. When there are Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark had a black slave too, and I think he ran off. Moses, I'm not for sure. It's what it makes me think. It sounds like. Also, Daniel Boone. There's a black guy. Pompey. There's a black guy with Daniel Boone, or against him. So just some shit that happened from the 1600s to the 1700s. This just says, the Spanish gave freedom to escaped slaves from the English colonies. So while the Spanish had introduced a lot of slavery, I mean, you got privateers and you got this ship, that ship. Everybody's kind of doing different things, right? Well, 1763, the French and Indian War is over, and Britain, the English, has conquered the French, and therefore they get the continent of North America, except for Florida. Due to the restrictions by the Spanish crown, the population of African slaves in Florida remained relatively low until around the period of British control in 1763. So after 1763, they're going to take it over, right? The British are going to take Florida over. And then you're going to see more slavery. So who was worse, the Spanish or the English? By knowing your history, I think it's a good question. 1693, the Spanish crown, beginning with Charles II, 1693, encouraged fugitive slaves from the British North American colonies to escape. He offered them freedom and refuge if they converted to Catholicism. This was well known through the word of mouth in the colonies of Georgia and South Carolina. I bet you that sucked for Georgia and South Carolina. Those racist slave-owning hundreds of enslaved Africans escaped to their freedom. Infuriated the colonies. Good. Thank God for goddamn Florida. It's almost like Haiti and Florida. It's like they set in motion. No, we're going to be about freedom, which infuriated colonists in the British North American colonies. They settled in a buffer community north of St. Augustine called the Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. That's the first settlement made of free black people in North America. So I don't even know what... just Free Black City. So in Free Black City, I mean, that's exciting. You have a Free Black City in Florida, 1693. Now you also have the Creek and Seminole Native Americans in Florida too. Now the Seminole's kind of interesting because I believe the Seminole is a mixture of all the original Native Americans. They call them something specifically, but basically the Seminole weren't the original Native Americans, but once you have all these new Native Americans, then they all kind of, all right, we're Seminole now. They established buffer settlements in Florida at the invasion of the Spanish government. They also welcomed any fugitive slaves which reached their settlements. So the Creek and the Seminole Native Americans also allowed black folks to run too. In 1771, Governor John Moultrie wrote to the Board of Trade that it has been a practice for a good while past for Negroes to run away from their masters and get into the Indian towns, from whence it proved very difficult to get them back. When British colonial officials in Florida pressed the Seminole to return runaway slaves, they replied that they were merely giving hungry people food and invited the slave owners to catch the runaways themselves. We have some more information here, but I guess I'll just read until the Cantino Planisphere. Apparently there's a map in 1502 that had drew Florida and a bunch of the nearby coast is depicted. So that's the Portuguese sailing, the Italy and Tristan de Luna y Arellano established the first settlement in Pensacola, 1559. After a violent hurricane destroyed the area, it was abandoned in 1561. In 1564, René Goulain de la Dunière founded Fort Caroline in what is now Jacksonville as a haven for Huguenot Protestant refugees from religious persecution in France. 1565, further down the coast, you had Pedro Menendez de Avilas founded St. Augustine. It's the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in any U.S. state. It's the second oldest only to San Juan, Puerto Rico in the United States' current territory. From this base of operations, the Spanish began building Catholic missions. Then they attacked Fort